I'm always sick. I don't know. I can't do anything. See all of this. What do you expect me to do? Fix it? I'm only 10. I can't even do anything anymore. I just want to be a doctor or anything to help my people. I can't. I'm just a kid.
The genocide continues. The Zionist state continues to kill Palestinians. Aid is being blocked. People are freezing to death. Everyone I know in Gaza is sick. Nobody has food, shelter, medicine.
Dr. Maura Finkelstein, a tenured associate professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Muhlenberg College, was fired in January 2024 solely because of one anti-Zionist repost on Instagram after being trolled for months by Zionists on social media. Finkelstein, who was Jewish, was attacked online as a self-hating Jew, a Nazi.
So Muhlenberg is a very Zionist institution, both through the students that they recruit and the money that sustains the institution. And the administration had to get rid of me, and they were never going to apologize. But what was meaningful, even though I was fired, and then I appealed several times, and in my last appeal, the school was both investigated by the American Association of University Professors that found out that Muhlenberg was a very bad actor and that the charges against me were not legitimate, and whatever academic freedom means, my academic freedom was denied. And so they sanctioned Muhlenberg, which I found vindicating.
From Barcelona to Athens, Mexico City to Rio de Janeiro, the weekend saw major protests in several cities against Israel's military campaign in Gaza. While estimates vary, organisers say 150,000 marched in The Hague on Sunday to put pressure on the Dutch government, dressing in red to symbolise the red line they say Israel has crossed.
I don't want to be complicit to these horrendous crimes happening there, and I want to speak out.
I want my government to speak out that this is not acceptable anymore, and I want to show this in my way.
I think that protests and rallies and marches have been important not to show the state the will of the people, but to create a sense of solidarity, a sense of unity.
I find that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide against Palestinians as a group in Gaza has been met. Specifically, Israel has committed 3 acts of genocide with the requisite intent, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group.
And we all have a role to play in this struggle, which always has to, for me, it always has to be about Palestine. Gaza is always central. We are witness to a genocide, a live stream genocide that I, as an American citizen, am helping to fund through my tax dollars. Even if I leave the country, I have to pay taxes in the US. But it doesn't stop at Palestine. We are seeing the ways in which all of these struggles are interconnected. They're global. They aren't bounded by borders. And if we think that we are safe and protected now, I think there's a rude awakening that's happening. We are all vulnerable. And so the only strength that we actually have is in connection, community, forging webs of solidarity, and being willing to give things up in order to work towards liberation and justice and a kinder world.
Hi everyone, today I have one of those guests who can make talking about factories and social structures genuinely exciting. Dr. Maura Finkelstein is an anthropologist, an author, and living proof that tenure, contrary to popular belief, is not a permanent position. In 2024, her tenure was unfairly terminated, making her one of the very few tenured professors in the United States to have her tenure revoked, and placing her at the center of national conversations about academic freedom. She is the author of The Archive of Loss, Lively Ruination in Mill Land Mumbai, which documents how Mumbai's mill lands remain socially and politically alive long after their official closure. Dr. Maura also publishes on Substack, where she covers a range of topics including Palestinian genocide, Zionism critique, academic freedom, and broader political and social commentary. Our latest article, Liberation is Our Horizon, reflects on political prisoners, hunger strikes, and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I strongly urge people to read her work. I will link her Substack in the video description. It is poignant and rooted in humanity. So without further ado, one of the nicest human beings you'll ever meet and a keen observer of people in their natural habitats, Dr. Maura Finkelstein. Great to be talking to you. How are you?
Thank you so much. That's such a generous introduction. Thank you for having me. I think considering how horrible everything seems to be, I'm happy to be spending my morning speaking with you.
No, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. And like you were saying before we started the recording, it's really cold over there, so it must be really difficult getting up in the morning, I guess.
And yet we do it.
Yeah. So how was your New Year? New Year Eve and New Year Day?
The New Year has been quiet. And yet also, I don't live in the US right now. I'm living in France. But watching US empire lose its bloody mind right now, like it's always been bad. And yet I feel like over the past few months watching it escalate, I can't necessarily say that the year is feeling particularly optimistic, but we persevere, I guess. How about you? How was your new year?
It was peaceful. Nothing happened in Australia. Nothing really happened in Australia, I guess. So that's good. I mean, the most we get is, a cat climbed up a telephone pole or something like that, which becomes the news. So yeah, but there have been some latest news of teen crime, which is disturbing. But I guess it comes and goes. I guess it's nothing horrible. Nothing horrible.
Yeah.
We did have one of Australia's, I think, biggest and horrendous mass shooting in Bondi just before Christmas, I guess. That was really horrible. I think 15 or 16 people died, including 2 or 3 children, which was really bad. But other than that, nothing much happens. It's really peaceful around here. Yeah. So
May we all live in boring times.
I think boring is better, I guess, so people can concentrate on their own hobbies and work, I guess, rather than being distracted by global headlines. Indeed. So I wanted to ask you, how did you get interested in anthropology? I mean,
that's a great question. It's one of those questions. I'm in my 40s now. I feel like every time I answer that question, it changes a little bit. But I think the most probably honest and boring answer. I mean, I studied anthropology as an undergrad. I minored in anthropology. But in terms of like wanting to be an anthropologist, I think like a lot of young people, my 20s, I had like a big idea of what I wanted to do, but not like a sort of specific concrete idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to grad school to buy myself some time. I wanted to travel. I wanted to write. And anthropology felt like a way to do that. I'm really curious about people. And I think it's actually quite hard to ask questions. I think it's like a vulnerable thing to do. I've found this in myself. I found this as a teacher. But I love the sort of unexpected magic or chaos, depending on how you want to interpret it, that happens when you just get people talking about things that they want to talk about. And anthropology gave me a way to do that sort of full time for a while in grad school and then as a professor.
So I guess
people are endlessly fascinating. Sorry.
People are, exactly. People, different cultures, different civilizations. I guess anthropology, like the way I understand it, and I'm not in academia anymore, it's like people watching with academic rigor, I guess, There's bird watching and then there's people watching, I guess.
100%. I would tell my students when I would teach methods classes that the ethnographic methods is basically taking our joys of like eavesdropping and people watching and professionalizing it.
I think that's true. So your book, Archives of Loss, how did you get interested in exploring India and those Mill Lands? What prompted you, what motivated you to go there?
Yeah, when I was growing up, one of my closest friends is from Calcutta, and we were really like interested and fascinated in each other's families, just as like proximity and distance. I spent a lot of time in her home eating Bengali food and hearing Bengali and hearing Hindi and watching Bollywood films. And so India always, even though I grew up in the United States, India always felt quite close and familiar. And when I was starting to travel as a young person, one of the first places that I spent a long period of time was India, which was really a wonderful experience. And so then when I was starting my PhD and thinking about where I wanted to do my research, I knew that I wanted to be in India, but I wasn't entirely sure where. And I love cities, and I knew I wanted to be in a city. And this friend's parents were living in Bombay at the time. They were like, come to Bombay, explore the city. And so I did, I think the summer after my first year as a PhD student. And they were living in an apartment building that had been newly built in the site of a former textile mill in central Bombay. And so I was spending time in this very particular part of the city, and I didn't really know what I was looking at. And I didn't, I felt like I had entered this massive construction site as this neighborhood was sort of being transformed from industrial lands to high-rise apartment buildings and shopping malls and whatnot. And it's funny, I tell this story a lot, but I think I was like very much shamed into the Mill Land project because I would like be in Parel, be in these neighborhoods and be like, oh, I don't, I want to go downtown. I want to go to Bandra. I want to go to all of these different parts of Bombay, but I don't want to be here in the center of the city that feels chaotic and loud and constantly under construction. And finally Gautam, my friend's father, it's like, you're a really bad anthropologist. You haven't even asked me yet what's happening in this neighborhood. And so finally I did. And I started to hear the history of the Mill Lands. And I think for me, the interesting thing was, and I write about this in the book in terms of infrastructure of, in Indian cities, these flyovers that can take you over parts of the city without ever going into them. I think my question was, why had I been unable to see what was going on right in front of me? Why had I always been wanting to leave this space instead of settling in and figuring out what was going on? And that really motivated the next decade of my life of thinking about how do we learn how to not see the things that are right in front of us? How do we learn how to not ask the questions that are right in front of us? And I think that's in some ways a survival strategy. Like we would be overwhelmed all of the time. But I think, whether it be living in the United States, living in New York, walking down the street, seeing unhoused people, everywhere. I mean, also in Bombay, any city you go to, and not, just seeing horror, seeing destruction, but also seeing, all of these elements of daily life and continuing on the path that we believe that we are supposed to be continuing on. Like, how does that become a way of being in the world? And I think at the end of the day, that was the question that really motivated me.
Yeah, it's a very poignant question. How does it become normalized, I guess, when you're flying over slums and, small communities of poor people who don't really have access to clean water as well. How does it become normalized in those big countries? That's a really, really deep question. So how was your experience writing the book?
I mean, when you're an academic writing a first book, it's usually, not always, but it's usually a dissertation that you then, transform into a book. And, just to be like nerdy for my academic friends and writer friends, I wrote a dissertation, a pretty bad dissertation, like most dissertations are, sort of as a shitty first draft of a book, with the mentorship of professors and the, community of graduate students in my cohort and above. And really like in a whole academic world in which I had support through my program to the extent that any grad student really has support. And I wrote a pretty standard dissertation that was what I needed to write in order to get a PhD and move on. And excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I have the sniffles. But then when I was writing the book, it's funny to think now of the position that I am in years later. But when I was writing the book, I was a sort of unknown assistant professor at a school nobody had ever heard of that was really inconsequential within my field. And it was actually really wonderful because nobody cared what I was doing. There was no real investment in the way that I was going to write my book. I had a great editor who wanted to publish it, and that was really lucky. But otherwise, I had this opportunity to not write a book so that I could, impress my department chair or my provost and get promoted, et cetera, but to write the book that I really wanted to write. And so writing the book was really like sitting in my apartment in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania for 2 summers. I wrote it over 2 summers and just thinking like, if this is my one shot, what kind of story do I want to tell? What kind of book do I want to write? How weird can this be? How creative can I be? How can I think about who I am as a writer? And it was this real gift of just not, we always, if we're writers or artists, I think we're always thinking about like, how will the world encounter our work if they encounter it at all? And so I was asking those questions, but I was also sort of allowed the freedom to be like, nobody really cares about this book. Nobody's asking for this book. Nobody needs this book. And so if I don't have the outside pressure that I had as a grad student writing a dissertation, what can I produce? And I think I wrote a pretty weird book. It was nice to learn how to be a writer in that way.
I think that's good. That's good. And I think it shows in your Substack articles as well. So, and then you went into academia, you went into teaching. So how was the teaching experience?
It's weird to think back on it now. I started teaching when I finished my PhD in 2012 as an adjunct in Oakland, California, at a school that doesn't exist anymore called Mills College. And that was a really incredible teaching experience. I had really amazing students there who, a lot of them were non-traditional students. They had been coming back to school. They were working their way through school. They were thinking very, very critically about who they were and why they were trying to get a college degree, maybe after having taken a break and done other things. And then I got a tenure track job at a small liberal arts college that was much more traditional. Almost all of my students were right out of high school. And I had, anywhere you are, you find incredible students. I had incredible students when I taught at Muhlenberg. But, then COVID happened, and already there was a crisis. There's been a crisis in American higher ed for decades. It's unaffordable. People are putting themselves into massive amounts of debt. There aren't jobs. I think that, I was watching my students more and more every day ask these really devastating existential questions about like, why are we here? What are we doing? And why are we going to be paying off this debt for the rest of our lives in order to get a degree that may or may not help us get a job? And I saw that become increasingly stressful for my students, in addition to, questions of race and class and access at a predominantly white institution in a relatively small city in Pennsylvania. But I think COVID really cracked something open, and not in a great way, across the globe. I mean, we were all experiencing it in different ways. And the past few years, I just really felt like we didn't recover from that. Education didn't recover from that, whatever that meant. And something's really shifted in, what the classroom is, what students expect from their faculty, what faculty expect from their students. And so, I'm just sort of like thinking out loud right now, but I'm not in the US right now, but I'm watching as, and it started years before, but really like over the past few years, we've watched higher ed in the United States just completely implode, crumble, explode, whatever you want to say about it. And, I think over my whole career, I've seen this question over and over and over again. what is education? What is teaching? What are these schools? What are these universities? What are these colleges? Even on the high school level, why on earth would anyone put themselves into massive amounts of debt for the rest of their lives in order to get a branded education when we don't really even know what learning is anymore? And it's been interesting to sort of be ousted from this space and wonder, like, are we on the brink of the absolute collapse of learning and education? Or are we moving in the direction of something revolutionary in which we can really rethink what learning and education and school actually is? And I'm naturally an optimist, and so I want to believe in the latter, but I'm also watching as, this hellscape gets scarier and scarier, and I'm fearing that maybe it's the former. And so, as somebody who doesn't currently have a job as a teacher, but can't help but find opportunities to think about teaching and learning, as an educator, I wonder more and more, are schools over, colleges and universities over, at least in the United States, and what will we find in their place? So again, I meandered a little bit away from your question, but I think we're really like in a moment of absolute crisis, and I'll be curious what that brings in terms of the creativity of thinking in more revolutionary ways about what it means to learn.
That's a very, very informative answer. And I guess you've touched on the important point. I think education has become an industry. So when you commercialize something and you make an industry, obviously students, they don't really have any jobs, so they have to get loans to get degrees. And then I think rightly so, most of them will be wondering why are they getting a degree, I guess, if it's not going to help them get a job. So do you want to go back to teaching again? Or maybe in France or in Europe?
Yeah, I think yes. I love teaching, and I love the opportunity to center learning in whatever I do. I am not, I have no faith or hope in American academia right now, and can't, I can't imagine finding a home there again. Both because I think I'm unhireable, and also because, I'm watching everyone I know who still has a job try to figure out how to twist themselves into knots to survive in the system that is crushing them, or take the kinds of, they shouldn't be risks, but say the things that need to be said, show up in the ways that, we need right now, and, really risk their future, their livelihood, their health insurance, their ability to, afford their mortgage or their rent, support their children. It's an absolutely terrifying time, and I don't know anyone in the US who's okay right now. So yes, if there are, jobs out beyond the American Academy, I am curious, and, please hire me. But I also think, sometimes being ousted from a system or leaving a system allows you to see possibilities and creativity in bigger and more expansive ways. And so I've also been thinking about, what does learning and scholarship and thinking and teaching and writing look like beyond institutions? Like, do we have spaces in which these things can happen? I think teaching and learning is always going to be the center of what I do, but the question is, what does that look like? And of course, in this world, it's also nice to have a salary because we live in capitalism. But yeah, it's a really scary and hard time to ask those kinds of questions. How do we do the work that we know we want and need to do? And also, how do we survive? I'm in France right now, and it's in many ways, it's a much saner space to be. Like, what is life like when you can afford groceries? What is life like when you're not worried about going into medical debt? These shouldn't be, coming from an American context, these are actually kind of wild questions. And I think, as an American citizen who's lived most of my life in the United States, I think I, like so many, have so normalized an unlivable way of encountering the world while also, subsidizing a genocidal state and contributing to an economy that is, abducting heads of state and, threatening to, take over territories left, right, and center. We've been involved. I'm just sort of going off, but people are talking about here comes World War III, and the U.S. has been instigating World War III for a very, very, very long time. What does it look like to sort of work and live inside that economy? It's pretty devastating.
No, that's true. That's true. I guess, and the challenge is that learning always requires critical thinking and looking at all aspects. I guess as a scientist, you look at different things, different ways to achieve something, and I'm guessing that's true in anthropology as well. That's true in any educational field also. So if you censor something, and I think that's what happened to you as well. So in 2024, your tenure was revoked at Muhlenberg College. So did they ever apologize after that, or no?
No, there's so many different ways to tell a story. I think that's, as a writer and thinker and academic, that's fascinating to me. But, one way to tell the story of what happened to me was that, my college was one of the more extreme and banal examples of what happens when you rely on funding from big donors to run your institution. And because of, the logic of capitalism, those donors then believe that they can control the nature of the institution. And so Muhlenberg is a very Zionist institution, both through the students that they recruit and the money that sustains the institution. And so I think, the administration was under an unbelievable amount of pressure within the first few weeks of the accelerated genocide in October 2023. A genocide that had been going on for 100 years. And so, in that way, the administration had to get rid of me, and they were never going to apologize. But what was meaningful, even though I did end up, I was fired, and then I appealed several times. And in my last appeal, the school was both investigated by the American Association of University Professors that found out that, beyond what I even knew of the story, that, Muhlenberg was a very bad actor, and that the case was not, the charges against me were not legitimate, and, whatever academic freedom means, my academic freedom was denied. And so they sanctioned Muhlenberg, which I found, vindicating. And also, one of the really horrible things about living through the early months of my investigation was that I felt very alone and isolated by, what is now, people are creating community in the US because they've been targeted, harassed, fired, et cetera, suspended. But at the time, I felt very isolated, and I was told by my school that I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody about the investigation, including my colleagues. And so most of my colleagues, I think, were willing to trust the administration that I did something truly egregious. I think there were people who thought I had attacked a student, physically attacked, there were crazy rumors that were circulating. And at the end, in January 2025, is that right? I actually got a hearing with faculty members at my college who saw the whole case and realized that there was no actual case, except for the fact that the administration and the college had acted very badly. And I think between the acknowledgement from a few of my colleagues of what actually happened and the AAUP, reporting on bad faith action by the administration. I don't care about the administration at my former employer. I don't care about my former employer. What I care about is that those bodies that actually matter saw what actually happened and didn't think that I should be fired. And, I think that that's really important for me, but I think it's really important for everything that's happening in the US to reveal the ways that this is just about donor pressure. This is just about political manipulation. This is not about, the only faculty members in the US who have done anything truly egregious are Zionists and white supremacists on the far right. When you think about faculty who are screaming as loud as they can against race-based violence, against genocide, there's really no limit to that speech. We should all be screaming as loud as we can about, ICE abducting our students and our neighbors, about our country funding a genocide, about, this new white supremacist fascist wave of, a government in a country that has been fascist for a very long time. I mean, it is our responsibility as people, as scholars, as writers, as thinkers, to be as loud as we possibly can about these horrors. And so, having at least some kind of community support around that, I think, is important, even though we're seeing power operate exactly the way that power operates.
Yeah, I mean, any community help or any help from friends, sort of in terms of emotional, moral support is good. So do you feel your background in anthropology helped you understand the Palestinian pain better than most people?
That's an interesting question. I think it's almost the opposite. I think another version to the traveling and writing is that I think one of my early interests in anthropology, even before I went to college, was that as a high school student in the 90s, I had an experience that I think is almost unheard of for any, American who is not Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, especially someone who's raised Jewish, where I had a high school teacher who put me in a situation in which I was reading about Palestine and not about the Zionist narrative about occupied Palestine, but reading Edward Said, reading Yasser Arafat, reading actual Palestinian thinkers. I hadn't found Ghassan Kanafani yet, but I had the opportunity to learn about Palestine when I was 16 and 17 years old. And what I realized was that while I had never been a Zionist, I'd never bought into a Zionist narrative. In fact, I hated nationalism. I never stood for the Pledge of Allegiance when I was in elementary school because I didn't like that. So I was why would I, if I don't want this nationalism, why would I adopt another nationalism? This is sort of ridiculous. But I had heard this sort of Zionist propaganda my whole life growing up in a Jewish community in the United States in the 90s. And then I saw that, if Palestinians are narrating their own experience, existence, political commitments, reality, it's a very, very, very different story. And I realized as a young person that, whoever tells the story controls the narrative, and that, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a historian or an anthropologist or a political scientist, but I was really interested in how people's stories could challenge powerful meta narratives. And Palestine really liberated my thinking as a young person to realize that I could not trust the Jewish Zionist American narrative about the region because it was actively involved or actively invested in erasing Palestinians and the existence of Palestine. And as an American growing up in the United States, I knew what that looked like because I saw that happening in my own settler colonial country with indigenous history. And so it made sense to see that my political investments were more aligned with rooting myself in Palestinian narratives that aligned with how I understood the world from an American context than it did to align myself with a, Jewish Zionist perspective. And And so that felt really important when I started studying anthropology, because even though I didn't work in Palestine, that lesson was something that I took to urban India. It's how I understood my interest in class politics and, the rise of Hindutva and sort of Islamophobia in an Indian context. And so I do think that because of Palestine, I think I became a better anthropologist.
So, I guess you talked about erasing culture of Palestinian people, because Palestine has existed as far back as 3,000 years in different forms, one another. I mean, during the Egyptian era as well, I think they were called Palisade, and then British Mandate, and even before that, Ottoman Empire, Palestine was called Philistine. It was a province. It's really difficult to erase a culture, but you see that effort being made, ever since Israel was created, or just even before Israel was created. And I'll give you an example. I mean, similar sort of stuff was happening in India as well under British colonial rule. Erasing people's identity or using language in a derogatory way to categorize people in different tribes, different communities. I mean, one example I can give is in 1871, British people, they enacted a law, criminal tribes law. So 127, 130 communities in India were just branded criminal. If you're born in that community, you are criminal. So there will be restriction on your movement, on the food that you will get. You have to report to police regularly, British police, these kind of things. And then subsequently, different laws were enacted to suppress rebellion and resistance as well. And you sort of see the same sort of pattern in settler colonial, wherever the settler colonial ideology exists, I guess. So, what I don't understand is because, my forefathers had to fight a lot of these people to get our land back. Eventually we succeeded, but there was a lot of killing, a lot of looting as well, but we eventually succeeded. And then we started fighting each other, which was really bad as well. But yeah, it's better than fighting someone else, I guess. So in the case of Palestine, the language was, I don't know how to say it properly, it wasn't stolen, but language was used in an exclusionary way. So the term Semites, so Semitic, as I understand, based on the education that we've got, and we go back to the roots. So Semitic is a linguistic and ethnocultural term. So it includes people who were born in the Semite region who were speaking 4 languages at that time: Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and Amharic, I guess. So Palestinians, Arabs, they are part of the Semitic tribe. But when the Europeans they coined the term anti-Semitism, I think it was in around 1800 something, they excluded the native population. Same way, I think Britishers were coining terms for Indians, and they were excluding certain tribes who were more resistant to the occupation. They were including other tribes who were favorable to the British occupation. So, and I never understood why that happened, but looking back, obviously Arabs didn't really have any power at that point, so they were not consulted. The natives were not consulted in these kind of definitions. So as a result, you see, them being dehumanized when the term is used. And when I talk to my Palestinian friends, obviously they say they are Semites as well. So any, genocide against Palestinian people is, by strict definition, is anti-Semitic genocide, I guess, something like that. But I don't see any pushback from academic community on these kind of definitions or these kind of semantic ways to delegitimize the claim of native population in Palestine. Do you think, do you know why that is? Or is that a very difficult concept to talk about?
No, you know the history better than I do, so thank you for that. But I will say, language we really normalize and naturalize the terms that we use for things, and it is often hard to think our way out of it. And so anti-Semitism, I think, has been used, especially in like the second half of the 20th century and 21st century, as this like very, very, very particular and sort of like historyless term that I don't use anymore when I'm thinking about what a lot of Palestinian scholars and writers and anti-Zionist scholars and writers are now refusing to engage and instead calling anti-Jewish hate instead of anti-Semitism, because it's actually specific and it's actually naming what is happening, and it's actually really revealing the way that
That's better.
Yeah, that anti-Semitism has, at least in the United States, but I also would say like in the UK and Germany, I mean, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but anti-Semitism has really become a dog whistle that is used to justify violence against Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and also anti-Zionist Jews, which is like a lesser concern for me, but nonetheless real. And so I do think that in these more leftist circles and in these more sort of like linguistically critical anti-colonial circles in which a lot of thinking is, you know, being done by Palestinian writers and scholars, anti-Semitism just, it doesn't mean anything. And therefore we have to stop using it because since it means everything and nothing, it can be used to shield actual violence. So like, for example, in the United States, all you hear about is rising anti-Semitism. But if you actually look at who is experiencing violence, it is not Jewish people, unless you're including Jewish people who are understanding themselves as anti-Zionist and are part of, you know, spaces of liberation work, whether it be protests or whatnot. There's violence there. You know, we saw this at the student encampments. But when we're actually thinking about where are we seeing violence and actual hate, the legislation of, you know, sort of normalizing violence, it's Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, Black, brown communities. So I do think that there is work to delegitimize anti-Semitism as a term that is interchangeable for anti-Jewish hate. But it's hard work, because in doing so, people get accused of being anti-Semitic, and legally that is much more dangerous right now than being, you know, a racist or an Islamophobe or supporting anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian violence. And so I think there's a real like linguistic trap that I, you know, see all the time, in which people like to revert to shorthand. They like to revert to the terms that they are comfortable with. And when that language has a violent past and is being manipulated for a violent present and a violent future, it's really insidious. And so, you know, as a person who writes about Zionism, I use the term anti-Semitism as a political project, but when I'm actually talking about what it has in the past meant, or what it could in the future mean, I'm very careful about actually explaining what I'm talking about instead of reverting to language. And, you know, this is something that I learned from, you know, Palestinian and anti-Zionist writers and scholars who know a lot more than I do, and who have sort of done the work of exposing the violence of this term. So I think it's a long struggle, and it's definitely an uphill fight in terms of the way in which governments and spaces of power in the US and Europe are using this term and manipulating this term. But I do see pushback.
Yeah, I think the pushback will have to come from academia. I don't see governments changing the definition anytime soon. Also because, I mean, so people like me who come from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all those regions, we've had one of the biggest genocides against us. So we don't really care what other people say. We can point fingers, okay, are you anti-Indian, anti-human? And we've got, again, I don't want to say it's not who's the biggest victim, but if you look at the history, if you read books, and those histories and those horrendous acts are not, you're not going to find them in British textbooks. You're going to find them in historians' books, I guess, which people don't read. I mean, Britishers used to tie resistance fighters to the cannon en masse, and they would blow them, and they would invite the whole tribes and villages to watch. So if you resist, this is going to happen to you. And there are hundreds of cases like that, and we've suffered quite a bit. Obviously, I referred to one of the studies in my email, but we are waiting for some more concrete studies to come out, because that study was done as a combination of a research study between three universities, one from Spain, one from UK, one from Australia. But again, the figures are horrendous. They didn't need to do anything at that point because they controlled the land, they controlled the food supply, so they would just take grains away from communities and villages, saying that this food needs to go to British soldiers, or this food needs to go back to Britain. They didn't need to do anything, and people would just die of hunger and left to rot in streets. It was horrendous back then. So, I mean, again, it's not who's the biggest victim. It's just that people who come from my area, we understand how these things are enacted systematically to erase culture and to dehumanize people, I guess. So do you see academic freedom? You mentioned that academic freedom is being stifled in America. America do have First Amendment, right? Australia doesn't have that. UK doesn't have that. Europe doesn't have that. But if academic freedom is being stifled in America, do you see any optimistic path forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really haunted by, I think there's a video that's been circulating of a young person, I think she looked college aged, in Grand Rapids, Michigan yesterday or the day before. I think she was wearing a keffiyeh, and she was being interviewed by a media worker. She was on camera, and she was obviously criticizing the US government's kidnapping of Maduro and invasion of Venezuela. And as she finished the interview, police just came up and abducted her off the street and arrested her and disappeared her. I don't actually know who she is or what happened to her, but I just saw this video. And so do we have free speech? We, in theory, can criticize the government, burn a flag, express our outrage over genocide, teach what we want to teach in theory. But in practice, I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these norms are, I'm not a political scientist, but are encoded within a very, very weak and precarious legal structure that Trump has completely steamrolled, but so did Biden. This is not like a Republican problem. I was fired under a Biden administration, and so what I'm seeing in practice is, on the one hand, the U.S. is a rogue state, and I don't trust anything in terms of our government, but also within the bounds of institutions. So thinking about academia and thinking about academic freedom, I'm seeing administrations at colleges and universities hand in hand with, legal structures, whether it be law enforcement or the courts, sort of rethinking, reshuffling how free speech and academic freedom work on campus in ways that are really, 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 really chilling. And so, one of the ways that that's happening in the US, and this is something that was started under the first Trump administration, is that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had been in place to protect to protect students, faculty, and staff from experiencing violence and exclusion based on race, shared ancestry. And under the first Trump administration, that was manipulated to include not religion, but Judaism. And now that's being used to accuse people who are exerting academic freedom and free speech to criticize a genocidal settler colonial regime, Israel. They're being accused of anti-Semitism. And so any speech that is critical of this foreign power is no longer, protected on our campuses, which, is a sort of, is going to have like a cascading effect, and has already, if we're seeing like people who have lost their jobs because they've, criticized Charlie Kirk, or, have, criticized fascism and therefore are Antifa, which, Trump has designated as a terrorist organization. So I think, we're seeing a revitalization of terrorism designations. I think we're seeing all of these ways, this is just to say, all of these ways in which lawfare always will find a way to undermine free speech and academic freedom in order to prop up political regimes that are invested in silencing in order to manufacture consent. And I think, Palestine really revealed the way that our freedoms within the landscape of rights are really limited by, liberal sensibilities, and fascism lives at the heart of, liberal democracy. And so I think what we're seeing is that a lot of our assumptions of norms in the United States are, to like draw on gendered language, kind of a gentleman's agreement that has been completely broken. I think, all bets are off in terms of what you can say and what you can do on college and university campuses. And I think we've seen over the past few years that that's really the canary in the coal mine in terms of how, rights-based freedoms are pretty meaningless in the United States. And I mean, that has a longer history. I mean, we've seen that in terms of healthcare, abortion access, anti-trans legislation. Rights can be given, rights can be taken away. And so I think academic freedom is one of those things that nobody in the United States can count on anymore. And I think that goes to include free speech.
Do you know of any people or anyone in academia who's been let go because of his pro-Israel views? I can't think of any, but
not a single person.
I see a lot of people who are pro-Palestine or anti-genocide. They've been let go or harassed, but I haven't heard of any who's on the opposite side and has been let go, I guess.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
probably, yeah.
I think that there's no investment in that, because if you think about the financial and political partnerships between the United States and Israel, and the ways in which money is flowing in and out between these two countries, the way in which, the Israeli Hezbollah regime is propping up all of these aspects of academia, there's, I think the only stretch that I could think of is Shai Davidai at Columbia University, who, I don't actually know what happened behind closed doors, but this was somebody who, in addition to being, a Zionist and having particular political views, wasn't, that was not the problem. The problem was that when he was harassing, stalking, assaulting Palestinian students, Columbia was fine with that. But I think then he harassed a staff member, and that set off a series of events that, you can do whatever you want to our Palestinian faculty, staff, and students, but, make a white American person feel uncomfortable, and then we actually have to do something. But he wasn't fired for being a Zionist. I think he was, he entered into negotiations to resign because he harassed or assaulted a staff member. I think that's the closest case that you could like turn your head to an angle and make an argument, but I don't know about anything else.
Yeah. But the problem is, like you mentioned, the donations that go to universities and colleges. I mean, most of them are on just on one side, on the side of, let's say, Israel, I guess, which I never understood. I mean, first, American students take too much debt to go to universities, and then universities take donations as well. So I'm not sure how the corporate structure, financial structure works. I guess I never understood that. But yeah, I mean, it would be nice if universities were, sort of away from all the political pressure. But it doesn't seem to happen. It doesn't seem that it's going to happen anytime soon, I guess. And I'm not sure how the situation of academia is in France. I guess France probably is in the same boat. They don't really have any First Amendment, so there's no free speech. There are hate laws, I guess, in France. There are hate laws in Australia. There are hate laws in United Kingdom. So obviously certain terms are banned. So in Australia, they've banned pro-Palestine protests, and the pro-Palestine protests have been very peaceful over here, and some of the largest, I guess. So every weekend you would go to library and you would see Palestinians, just making speeches, stuff like that, and there would be like 20 different police people with cameras, with badges, evidence collection authority. I'm not sure what evidence they're collecting, but yeah, those are students just talking about Palestinian struggle and genocide. So I guess, but the problem is for Palestinians, there's no one coming to help them. There is no support from the outside world, even though United Nations recognize their right to resist the occupation. No one's going to help them. No one is helping them. The Arab nations around Palestine, they don't want Palestine to be formed because obviously they are monarchies, and Palestinian people, they want democracy. So if there's a democracy in the region, then their own people will question why they have monarchies. And when it comes to wealth, Muslims have probably the most amount of wealth, especially the people in the Arab region. And if Qatar can give $550 million plane to American president and then get bombed, I'm sure some of that money could have gone to universities in America as well, but it didn't. So there's no political will to establish a Palestinian state. I think that's my understanding, that's my feeling, which is why I think the end game for Palestinians will be, absolutely horrible. So I was listening to Francesca Albanese. She was saying that according to her estimate, 680,000 Palestinians have been killed, and most of them are under the rubble. So people don't really know how many are under the rubble. And it's interesting what happened to Francesca Albanese and Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor. So they got sanctioned by America under executive order, so they can't access their bank account. They can't do anything. Financially, they've been kidnapped. So you sort of wonder, there is absolutely no freedom. There is no international body that can help them. And if you try to help them, you get sanctioned. I mean, what's the way forward? That's the issue. And I don't think many people have any answers, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like I've said earlier, I'm an optimist, and it's been really hard these past few years to be an optimist. I think, one of the things, and, I think that there are so many folks who know way more about this than I do. So, take this all with a grain of salt. But I do think that nothing that operates within the systems that power allows us to operate in is going to bring about any revolutionary change. So, I think that protests and rallies and marches have been important not to show the state the will of the people, but to create a sense of solidarity, a sense of unity. It's a performance for the world. It's a performance for each other. I don't think it's without value, but it doesn't change anything. We're either allowed to protest or we're not. We're either allowed to protest or our protests are shut down, we're arrested, we're brutalized by the police, et cetera, et cetera. None of that liberates Palestine. None of that, brings, topples the American and Israeli regimes. What I think has been the most meaningful to see is either, and I'm not romanticizing any nation state, but I do think, like, if we're looking at like Yemen or Iran, even in like certain actions that states can take if there is an investment in particular political projects that are outside sort of the bounds of, the respected liberal order. And then I think that there's direct action. So when I think about the work that is doing the most, or is it not the most good, but the most productive in terms of undermining the Zionist project, I'm thinking about Palestine Action. I'm thinking about the Filton 24. I'm thinking about the hunger strikers, many of whom are on the brink of death right now, who understand that protests are not going to bring liberation, but actually destroying the sites of violence, whether it be Elbit, weapons manufacturers, et cetera, that is actually how we can bring about change. And there's a very real risk and violence. I mean, Palestine Action has been, designated as a terrorist organization by the British government. People are getting arrested. The hunger strikers and other members of the Filton 24 have been horribly treated in prison, and yet they have also been really successful in creating scenarios in which different campuses of Elbit have been forced to shut down. And if they are providing, 80+% of weapons to the Israeli state, that's actually it's not going to end the genocide, just that, but these are actions that I think can really bring about change if they can become more widespread, which I think is just one way of operating outside of, liberal respectability, which is, going to a protest. Again, I don't, I want protests to happen, but I don't want people to think that protesting brings about any kind of revolutionary change. It operates within the system. And I think what we're seeing after, 2.5 years of genocide, 100 years of genocide, is that we need to be thinking of different ways to work outside of the system if we want to actually bring the system down. I am not a person who thinks expansively in terms of, being a visionary about what that work actually looks like. But I do think that that's where a lot of the important work is happening. And I think that the work of figuring out how to not just go after weapons manufacturers, but to go after Zionist institutions wherever we find them, whether it be our schools, our places of employment, synagogues and temples, who are, spaces in which, stolen Palestinian land is being auctioned off, and money is being, funneled into the Zionist entity, et cetera, et cetera. Like, how do we destroy those spaces? And I don't mean like, I mean destroy Zionism as an ideological and political project.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And one thing I don't understand from outside of America is, do Americans not care that their money is going to another country, I guess, and that country has healthcare, good education system, they get, good housing as well. Americans don't really get any benefits. So do Americans not ask these questions from their politicians? I mean, what's happening over there? I never understood that mentality. Or that's just the culture over there. Don't ask questions from politicians, I guess.
Yeah, it makes me feel completely insane, to be perfectly honest. But I also think that there are all of these different ways that a country like the US, a settler colonial country that, we're seeing more and more, is also an expansionist, violent illegal rogue state, just like the state of Israel. I mean, there are so many similarities between these two states. And so, is Israel in charge of the United States? Is the United States in charge of Israel? I don't know. I think I see both arguments, but the sort of enmeshed economic, political, and social projects of both the United States as a violent settler, colonial, imperial power, and the economic, political, social project of the state of Israel as an settler, colonial, imperial power. I mean, that is a very critical partnership. And I do strongly believe that when the state of Israel ceases to exist, which hopefully will happen in my lifetime, and when, the United States, and when Palestine is liberated, the U.S. is next. I mean, that's a very, very dangerous threat to a nation state like the United States. And so I think, because of that, there are all of these ways in which the political, social, and economic institutions of the United States can, manufacture a narrative that supporting Israel, whether it be from a Christian nationalist position, whether it be from a white supremacist position, whether it be from a Jewish Zionist perspective. I mean, these are projects that are completely intertwined. You can galvanize support because of the fear of what would happen in the United States if and when the state of Israel collapses.
Yeah, I mean, the United States is obviously it was a colonial project, but eventually they gave rights to natives. Australia also, and Australia is very funny. What they did was they came here, killed a bunch of Aborigines, and then said, "Oh, look, nobody lives over here, so we'll call it Terra Nullius and call it Australia." And Aborigines were throwing boomerangs at them. No, we still live here. So, but eventually they gave rights to Aborigines as well. New Zealand is the same. They gave rights to Aborigines or Maori people later on. Israel, I don't see them giving rights to Palestinians because it is an ethno-state, and they made it very clear recently as well, and as far back as 1923 when Vladimir Jabotinsky, their Zionist leader, said that there's no room for two people. Arabs would have to go from here. Ben Gurion said the same thing, that obviously Palestine is a nation, it's their land, but we will have to drive them away. And there is no desire on the part of Israel to achieve peace or give equal rights to Palestinians. Because I've always wondered, I mean, there are like two solutions. One is one state solution, everybody gets equal rights. Israel doesn't want that. Or have a two-state solution. Israel doesn't want that either because they want the entire land to themselves based on whatever they think their religious stuff says, I guess. So, and nobody's making them do that. That's the thing. Everybody is sending them aid and weapons. Even Australia sends them weapons as well, which is why I think it's really difficult for Palestinians to win back their homeland, which is a really horrible condition to be. But Palestinians are some of the most, strong people that I've encountered. The literacy rate before October 7 was like 97%. Women were more educated in Palestine, and because that's the way to go. If they are more educated, they can go to other Arab countries and get work over there. There are few countries who have a literacy rate of 97, and Palestinian, despite being occupied, has a higher literacy rate. But it's a really tough position to be in as a Palestinian, I guess. So you were raised as a Jewish person, is that right?
It is.
How did your upbringing shape your view on Israel-Palestine war and Israel-Palestine divide?
Yeah, I do want to say that the U.S. operates within, I know less about Australia and New Zealand, but the United States as a settler colonial country operates like rights can be given, rights can be taken away, treaties can be broken, treaties can be overlooked. And, I don't think rights are the way that we can understand inclusivity and, equality, whatever these like liberal buzzwords are. I think that if you look at the United States and you see the violence and the discrepancies in terms of health and wealth and land and housing and like everything, you see that like there is still a genocide happening in the United States. It looks different than it did, a couple hundred years ago, but Native communities have consistently been experiencing the slow death of settler colonialism, regardless of whether or not they can vote. And so, I think that it is a different model than the state of Israel. But I do think that in terms of the logics of settler colonialism, there's a lot of resonance. And I think, that was a lesson that I learned as a young person. And I saw Jewish supremacy in my community when I was young. I didn't know that was what I was seeing. I didn't have a term for it, but and this was really solidified when I started reading about Palestine when I was a teenager. But even before that, this notion that Jewish people are entitled to an ethno-state, they're entitled to this homeland, that never sat well with me. And I really bristled at most of the encounters I had with Israelis and Jewish Americans who felt a tie to Israel when I was a young person, because at the heart of that relationship was Jewish supremacy. And I think any supremacist project, and again, I was young, I didn't have the language for this, but looking back now at the, I can say ambivalence, but also I did not like being Jewish when I was growing up. I did not like the social and religious and political spaces that I grew up going to, Sunday school, Hebrew school. I got bat mitzvahed, I got confirmed. Like I was part of a Jewish community until I was about 16. And I hated it. I hated the sense of superiority that I was experiencing being shoved down my throat. I wanted nothing to do with that. And, I think that is Zionism. Jewish supremacy is Zionism. Zionism is Jewish supremacy. And, I spent a lot of time within the first year of the genocide arguing that Zionism and Judaism are not the same, but I don't actually believe that. I think that I felt like it was my obligation as a Jewish person to make a distinction between a religious and political project. And what I learned from my childhood is that Jewish people in America, for the most part, replaced God with Israel. And I actually don't think that there's much difference between Judaism and Zionism right now, at least in terms of the way it plays out on a national stage. And, I don't feel a connection to, I claim my Jewishness because I do not want to lie or disavow my identity. And my name is Maura Finkelstein and, I look like this. It's not like it doesn't, follow me. And I think it's important to be honest and transparent about who we are, but I don't feel a connection to Judaism. And I think that the only connection to Judaism that I've ever felt is through explicitly anti-Zionist, pro-resistance, pro-liberation spaces that include Jewish people who inhabit those sensibilities and orientations and identities in the world. But yeah, I would say that, being raised, just to sort of, wrap up my tangent, I think, being raised Jewish in the United States at the end of the 20th century means that you are either being indoctrinated as a Zionist or you are being alienated I'm sure that there are other ways that people have experienced it, but for me, this is sort of what I witnessed as the two options.
Yeah, I mean, there are many Jewish people who support Palestinian freedom, who don't align with Israel's genocidal policies. There are millions of Jews as well who don't align with Israel's genocidal policies. In Australia, we've got a Jewish Council of Australia who actively, they used to go to protests when protests were happening, pro-Palestine freedom protests. So there are a lot of Jews who support the equal rights for both Palestinian and Israelis. But I guess because America is such a powerful country, and we've just seen America kidnap a sovereign country's leader, and it can do that. People, I don't think resist. Yeah, but again, I'm sort of going back to my, let's say, realistic view. But I don't see resistance coming from any other country except America. One good thing about America, even though you mentioned freedom of speech is being stifled, they do have that First Amendment. In Australia, we don't. In Europe, we don't. So Australia was already worse when it comes to criticizing Israel. It's going to get even worse now. Because Chris Hedges was supposed to give a talk here last year in September. It was Edward Said's memorial organized by Australian Press Freedom, something like that. But the last minute his talk was cancelled because he sent the synopsis of his speech. It was about lack of investigative journalism and journalist death in Palestine war, and they didn't approve of that. So his talk was cancelled. So, and I think obviously we've got cases against Francesca Albanese, against yourself, and against Kareem Khan. So again, not sure where the resistance is going to come from. But how's your experience of that in France? Do you see French people more welcoming to a Palestinian state, or they just don't care?
Yeah, I have definitely seen, I think that we situate ourselves where we do. So in the circles that I travel in, they're anti-Zionist, they're pro-Palestinian liberation, support Palestinian resistance. I have seen possibly more complacency, but also, especially in the first few months that I was here, there were these sort of widespread union marches that were really inclusive. I saw Palestinian flags in all of these spaces, people wearing keffiyehs, queer and trans flags. It seemed as though this was a much more comprehensive movement about workers' rights and liberation and freedom and whatnot. And, you will see that in Palestinians, spaces in the United States that are, supporting Palestine and anti-Zionist, but I see that less integrated into other spaces. But I also think that I've seen a quieting. And I think one of the scariest things that I'm witnessing right now and that I'm hearing from, Palestinian organizers and folks in Gaza is that the world wants to believe that there's a ceasefire, and there's no ceasefire. And so, the genocide continues. The Zionist state continues to kill Palestinians. Aid is being blocked. People are freezing to death. Everyone I know in Gaza is sick. Nobody has food, shelter, medicine, whatever. And I think that there's a sense that the ceasefire has brought, in the West, I think that there's a sense that the ceasefire has brought something of a shift. And I think that quieting over the past few months, I think is really quite disturbing and startling. But I also think it's complicated because, these public protests are proving to be very specific, but they aren't how we get free. And so the one thing that I have seen that gives me a little bit more comfort is that I think that there's more organizing that's happening and I think this has always been happening, but I think that like the energy right now that I see being directed towards direct action, towards other forms of organizing, that's like an international movement that gives me a little bit of hope. But I do think, in France and I saw this in Spain recently, that the idea of a ceasefire is creating a lull, and that's really, really dangerous.
Yeah, that's true. But Spanish people, they sort of realized the Palestinian struggle, so they were on board with Palestinian struggle from the very beginning. So that's a positive. But that's people, even I think to some extent, the government was also wanting Palestinian freedom as well. So, what's the message that you want to give to people who want to keep voicing their argument for Palestinian freedom and their freedom from occupation? How do they go about it, and what can they do?
Yeah, I've been saying the same thing over and over and again for a while, and I feel like I need a new strategy because of where we are. But I do think, I meet a lot of people who already know this. I don't even know who I'm talking to anymore. But I think that we cannot bring about real revolutionary change if we are not willing to lose things. And, coming from an American context in which people don't want to lose things. And that, I think like when your job is or when your healthcare is tied to your job and your ability to survive is so precarious, like the idea of losing a job is very scary. I mean, that is the monster of capitalism, which, I think is one of the biggest threats to the world, capitalism and the nation state. That's just me. But I think like we don't get rewarded for this work, and we are seeing more and more that not only are people not getting rewarded for this work, but they are losing things that, they may or may not be able to lose, whether it be work, whether it be freedom through incarceration, whether it be bank accounts being frozen, access to healthcare, safety, etc. But if we aren't prepared to lose things, we are never going to bring about change. We can't bring about change in a sort of creeping reform that exists within the bounds of what power allows us to do. And so I encourage people to think about what they have and what they can afford to lose and what they can bring. I mean, we all have a role to play in this struggle, which always has to, for me, it always has to be about Palestine. Gaza is always central. We are witness to a genocide, a live stream genocide that I, as an American citizen, am helping to fund through my tax dollars. Even if I leave the country, I have to pay taxes in the US. But it doesn't stop at Palestine. We are seeing the ways in which all of these struggles are interconnected. They're global. They aren't bounded by borders. And if we think that we are safe and protected now, I think there's a rude awakening that's happening. We are all vulnerable. And so the only strength that we actually have is in connection, community, forging webs of solidarity, and being willing to give things up in order to work towards liberation and justice and kinder world. And that's a really scary thing to do. But I think it's the only way that we get free. Because I do not, I mean, what does freedom feel like right now, even if you're not in Gaza? I mean, everyone I know is scared, feeling vulnerable, feeling precarious. What are we holding on to so tightly as these things slip through our fingers? If now is not the time to give up some of our comforts in service of a bigger project, I don't know what would be.
That's a beautiful message. If I can ask you one last question, just regarding your message as well. What was the moment that made you say, okay, I'm going to fight the occupation, I'm going to voice my concern about Israeli genocide? How did you get into all that? Because, I mean, the reason I'm asking is because you had tenure, you could have had a very easy life. I mean, why risk all that?
Yeah. Anyone who knows me would be like, she will always find a way to make her life as complicated as possible. Yeah, that's a great question. I started teaching and talking about Palestine has been part of my career since I was a grad student. In 2004, I was at Columbia University getting my master's when Hillel International and a few other Zionist organizations went after Joseph Massad. And so it was the first time I saw how Zionist organizations on college and university campuses operate. So that was over 20 years ago. So that, as a grad student and as a junior faculty, I wanted to figure out how I could I wasn't a scholar of Palestine, but I wanted to talk about Palestine. I wanted to teach about Palestine. And I did that work, and I did it pretty under, not intentionally, but sort of undercover. I think, I was in Palestine in 2018 for the first time. And I think, I didn't see anything I hadn't read about from reading Palestinian writers, but I think seeing it up close in my face, seeing the violence of occupation, I wasn't in Gaza, I was in the occupied West Bank. It made me want to, as an anthropologist, and as a teacher, it made me want to write about Palestine. So I sort of started, before the genocide, I had two essays about teaching about Palestine that I published. But I think that really, that question of, are you willing to say the things that you feel need to be said regardless of the risk, was something that I had been thinking about for a really long time. And to be perfectly honest, and I feel pretty naive about this now, in October 2023, I thought that my position as a tenured professor and my position as a Jewish person was going to protect me, because it had, I got tenure having already published about Palestine, even though I was at a Zionist institution. I think I was pretty naive. But I think actually seeing and experiencing the backlash, the attack, the coordinated Zionist attack, hand in glove with my college administration, kind of made me double down and be like, what do they have that I'm actually afraid to lose? And it turned out to be very little, so that I could actually live with myself. And I think that I've seen a lot of scholars, academics, writers be very brave in this moment. But I've seen a lot of people put their head down and betray their own scholarship, their theory, their investments in order to keep themselves safe and protect the things that they have. And I guess my question is is it worth it? How do you live with yourself? I think that, for me, I have very little that I can bring to the table, actually, but writing and teaching are two of those things. And if I stop doing that, then what, how on earth would I live with myself? I think, I have, like everybody else, I have seen the worst things I have ever seen in my life over the past 2.5 years, live streamed to me on my phone by, mostly Palestinians in Gaza. I've done very little when I think about what the stakes are of this moment. we can always do more. And I don't know. I'm sort of just, rambling, but I think, I'm often asked like, oh, you've given up a lot. I've given up very little. I've risked very little. And the things that I've lost are things that, I wouldn't want to hold on to them in exchange for complicity and becoming a person that I can't look in the mirror. And I think we all have to ask ourselves in this moment, like, who do we want to be? Who can we be during a time in which everything is at stake?
I think one good thing is that more and more prominent people, also from Hollywood, they are raising their voices against the genocide. So that's a positive. And I guess you've joined an esteemed group of people, along with Professor Norman Finkelstein and Professor John Mersheimer, who also lost their job, but they lost it way back. So you probably a more recent casualty, I guess. Well, look, thank you very much, Dr. Maura. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I know. I think you're not feeling well as well, so I wouldn't keep you any longer.
Sorry about
you
my
need some
sniffles.
warm tea. I was gonna drink my tea, and I felt really bad if I drink it in front of you.
No. Oh, you should have.
I'll do it later. Yeah. No, thank you very much for your time. We really enjoyed.
Thank you for
talking
having
to
me.
you, and wish you luck with everything that you do in your life. And I'll stop recording now.